So folks, we got another Titans card review, and this time around we're in Warlock, and we got a crazy card here. I love this so much. Loken, Jailer of Yogg-Saron. He is a new 6-mana 3/3 legendary. Battlecry, discover a minion from your deck, and then summon a tentacle with its stats and taunt. And yes, Warlock just got a 15/15 Phantom, and this can summon you a 15/15 with taunt on turn 6. It's also noteworthy you get the card in hand. It is actually discovering it and pulling it into your hand. So this is both sometimes a minion tutor for some awesome thing you're looking to find specifically, and sometimes gigantic stats. It's also worth noting that we have the card, shoot, I had it pulled up. Where'd it go? Here it is. Forge of Wills, the location that got revealed a long time ago. If you make a 15/15 with Loken, you can copy it with Forge of Wills that you preemptively loaded up on board for 2 15/15s, which, look, that's crazy, right? That's really big. There is really cheap removal in the game. You know, it takes a single light it burns to deal with some of these minions, but I think a lot of decks will absolutely get shut out by that, particularly like aggro decks that can't deal with taunts, that don't have removal like that. Instant game winner. Some control decks even might not be able to deal with both of those things, which is kind of crazy. So it has a really tight deck building restriction, because obviously if you want to hit the crazy home runs, Phantom, they had Jailer in the reveal video, another good example, Big 10-10 or whatever. You can't have a lot of minions in your deck, right? So you're going to have a real deck building challenge to be super consistent with this sort of card. But the payoffs might make it worth it. When you high roll this and actually get this down on 6 or even 5 with coin or whatever, it may actually pay off enough to be worth it often enough. So I don't know, man. It's not like you're committed all into this necessarily. You just have a limited pool of minions. Are there enough spells in Warlock to kind of fill in the gaps? Can you get the right balance of stuff? That's a hard question to answer, but the power spikes are so big. I'm certainly intrigued by a card like this. I think it has a chance to be kind of broken good sometimes. So moving on here, we've got Imprisoned Horror, a 9-mana 5/5. It costs 1 less for each damage you've taken on your turns this game. So a couple things to note there. This is per damage, not per instance of damage. So a life tap, for instance, will discount this by 2, not by 1. Also, this is on your turn. So obviously your opponent hitting you in the face is not going to help. You're going to have to use your own cards to activate this one, which in wild format sounds terrifying. I think people are saying you can basically play this on turn 1 or 2 or whatever, perhaps pretty reliably. In standard format, you don't have quite as many options. There's the classic stuff like Flame Imp. We've got Spirit Bomb still in standard. Running through the list here. There's the fatigue damage package with Crescendo and all this stuff from Festival of Legends that could be a pretty decent enabler if you're able to ramp up your fatigue damage quickly enough. So there's some stuff. I mean, there's definitely enough to get this going. You know, I think it's the sort of card that would probably still come down in the mid game, probably like turn 4 or turn 5, but I don't think it's crazy to see this as, you know, 3-mana card, 2-mana card, 0-mana card by the mid game, which case it might feel a little bit, you know, kind of like a Light Ray in Paladin. I do think this is probably a little bit harder to activate. You're going to have to build your deck towards it and point towards it, as opposed to just incidentally stumble into it like you do for Light Rays in Paladin. It's also noteworthy this doesn't have taunt, so it forces the action a little bit less. But, you know, a couple Flame Imps already makes this a 3-mana 5/5. So it's not that hard to get it down quickly, right? So yeah, the cards like this are always scary. That Corridor Creeper effect of 0-mana 5/5s, the Light Ray effect of 0-mana 5/5s. That's always something you have to keep an eye on. So as soon as a deck finds the right balance of these self-damage cards and you know, getting this down quickly enough, that could be a pretty scary threat. So moving on here, we've got Wing Welding, a 4-mana spell. This one's going to discard your highest cost card and deal damage equal to its cost to all minions. So that's right, if you're running this in that Phantom deck, this can deal 30 damage to all minions, which you probably don't need to do, but is cool in theory. So yeah, this is a pretty efficient little board clear, and I think in some cases you'll be happy to sacrifice a high cost card if you're getting swarmed and overwhelmed by a more aggressive deck. You may not need an 8-mana play if you just need to stay alive right now on turn 4 or 5 as your opponent's really swarming you out. So losing that resource, losing that big thing is fine. You're going to stabilize enough against an aggressive deck who's going wide against you. They're not going to be able to keep up with your mid-game cards. You're just going to have enough stuff later. So solve the problem now, and it's all good. And I think this is a definite way to solve problems now. You probably don't even need this to be crazy. 5-6 mana could be a great result. Now, on that note, we actually do have some cards that could reward this specifically, stuff like Soul Barrage, which we're going to talk about a little later in the video as well. But this would be an amazing hit, right? Clear the board and deal 6 damage to the opponent's face if Soul Barrage happens to be the highest cost card in your hand. So this could be both a tool, I think, in a control deck that's just looking to stabilize and have a board clear, but also might specifically be a tool in discard decks as well. If you have the right sort of things to discard, this can actually pay off in additional ways on top of just being, I think, a really efficient mid-game board clear. So this looks pretty good. So next up here, we have Monstrous Form. This is a 1-mana shadow spell. It's going to give a friendly minion +3/+3 until your next turn. So this is kind of like a power overwhelming, a little lower on the buff, but instead of the minion dying horribly, it just kind of loses its buff. It becomes less monstrous over time. And this actually seems like a sneaky good little buff. It's one of those things where, yes, of course, you like stats to be permanent, but sometimes you don't need them to be. If you're just pushing for face damage and ending the game, this is just +3 sometimes, and that's going to be great. You're just happy to end the game. There are other ways to kind of force your opponent's hand a little bit with a buff like this, where you put it on a taunt minion, for instance, and you just slam this on a taunt and they have to deal with the stats and so on. Or you just trade this up. You play this on a minion that needs to take a trade. Even if it's a bit of a value trade, you're just happy to clean that up and leave your minion behind so that it loses the buff. That's totally fine. Or maybe just increase the survivability of a high value thing on board. You know, you got something that normally has 3 health that you're worried is going to get removed. You want it to live into a future turn. Just give it 6. This lasts through your opponent's turn. If they can't deal 6 damage, you might have made that minion survive when it otherwise wouldn't have, and that sets up whatever kind of future other play. Now, I think some of those are a little more specific and lower utility than other use cases. I think in a lot of instances, just pushing face +3/+3 might be the way this card goes, but it does have a few different angles to see play, which is pretty cool for a card like this. It might therefore sneak into a handful of different decks that has surprising synergies for it. So moving right along, we've got Chaotic Consumption. This is a new 1-mana spell, and this one's going to allow you to destroy a friendly minion to destroy an enemy minion. And based on the way that's worded, I think that's going to allow you to multi-target this. So you pick the friendly minion that gets destroyed, and I think you're going to get to pick the enemy minion that gets destroyed as well. And this is basically a card we'd seen many years ago. I forget the name, but just like a way cheaper version. I think it's 1 mana instead of 3, if I recall. And I think that makes this really good, actually. I think this card has some shocking utility, both, of course, straight up as a removal card. You just play some little junk thing, some little battlecry minion, whatever throwaway card, and you're able to sacrifice that and maybe kill something gigantic of your opponents. We know this cheap removal can be really effective on big stuff, just allowing you to, you know, counter swing, maintain tons of mana flexibility after dealing with their big threats. But beyond that, we've also got this little death rattle package that's been kind of coming along in Warlock over the last few sets. We're just getting more and more little death rattle pieces. We got some exciting new death rattle stuff in the neutral set for Titans as well. So I actually think this could be the sort of thing that's great with egg style decks. Any of those cheap death rattles you're looking to activate anyway. This gives you a way to activate your death rattles and reap some enormous upside. So it's not downside for upside. In many cases, it might actually be upside on upside, which for a 1-mana spell is completely insane. That's going to be really strong. We've even got some big death rattle stuff as well for Warlocks. You could even use this on some of your bigger death rattles as well if you wanted to. Your ooze or whatever is a possibility for this one. So I think this card has, you know, great straight up removal potential for defensive decks. I think it's actually got shocking kind of early game death rattle synergies and maybe even some late game death rattle shenanigans as well. So all in all, card that works in a lot of different ways, super efficient from a mana standpoint. I have to imagine some deck's going to figure out a way to play this one. So moving on here, we've got Mortal Eradication, which looks awesome. A 3-mana shadow spell. It's going to deal 5 damage randomly split among all enemy minions, and then it's going to restore 2 health to your hero for each one killed. So obviously the ideal scenario here is that your opponent has 5 1 health minions on board and you wipe them out and you heal for 10. And you're like the happiest person ever, because that's awesome. The reality for me is a little less clean than that. I don't think you're going to get too many board states where it lines up all that well. Just looking at Hearthstone these days, right, there's a lot of stuff that's bigger. There's a lot of 3 health things, even at the 1 cost slot. Like, yes, there are, of course, little 1/1 rushers that get summoned, and we're going to see those 1/1 spark bots and stuff, but even those are like magnetic. Piranhas trade in, 1/1 rushers trade in. I just don't think there's a lot of board states where you're going to see that perfect 5 minion 1 health split. I think far more often you're going to see like 2 3/3s, right? And you'll get one of the 3/3s and you'll leave behind a 3/3. And you'll only heal 2, which I don't think you're going to feel super excited about, you know? There is one angle that maybe saves this, is that if you've got another board clear that's not quite big enough, you know, you got like deal 3 to the board and a bunch of 4 health stuffs on board, and you use this as like a cleanup after your board clear, but it's like such specific math. It's like you don't really want to play board clears that aren't good enough in tax, like a 3 mana overhead just to finish solving that problem for, you know, a healing upside basically. So I don't know, man. I think the math on this is gonna end up being really clunky more often than not. There may be some metas this pops in when there's just that, you know, endless wave of 1 health stuff that this is the perfect answer for, but I think that'll actually be more rare than more common. So yeah, I really just unfortunately don't think this is going to be a staple for control Warlock decks. So speaking of that, this is the Thornveil Tentacle here. A new 2 mana 2/2. It's a lifesteal and Battlecry, deal 2 damage to a random enemy minion. And man, this is the sort of card, much like the last one, that I would just love to be good. Like, I love this kind of card. Let me play little minions that feed into my control game plan, that feed into my survivability. I just want things like this to work. Like, this is the sort of card I would love to see more of in Hearthstone if it's, you know, good and the game actually allows something like this to succeed. I'm afraid the reality, though, is that this just cannot really keep up with what you need out of Hearthstone. Number one, the Battlecry is a random enemy minion. You can't target this one, so, you know, it's going to hit a 3/3, and it's going to feel like you kind of wasted this, and you just plop down a 2/2. And, like, yes, the 2/2 has lifesteal, but that's not going to net you much upside. So is a 2/2 with, like, 2 guaranteed healing, sometimes 4 healing, gonna feel worth it? I don't think it is. I don't even think this compares favorably to other similar early game kind of life gain / removal cards Warlock has had in the past. If you think about things like Drain Soul or Touch of the Nathrezim, this is actually in a really similar space to those cards. Yes, this deposits a body on board, but those had other upsides, being, for instance, shadow spells and so on. So I just think this is unreliable, slightly more efficient in some ways because of that body on board, but still not a very exciting play. Also a card that does not scale well at all into the late game. Things like Drain Soul and Touch of the Nathrezim, because they were targeted, could often still be useful in the late game. Not to mention they can be doubled or copied, etc. But you know, you can line up the math basically in the late game and still make them good. This is not going to have an easy time lining up the math. It's never really going to clear the things you want. It's just going to chip 2 into random stuff. There might be very occasional instances where you have a board clear that leaves behind like 1 thing, and this cleans it up really perfectly, but that's still hard to orchestrate and still doesn't feel super efficient. So listen, I more than anybody, I want this card to be good. I want this to work. I just don't think the numbers are there. It doesn't look big enough to me, and doesn't do quite enough for what you need. So then we've got Disciple of Sargeras. This is a new 4 mana 3/3 with a Battlecry. Discard a spell to summon 2 3/2 imps, or Forge, give them +2 health and taunt. So if you spend 2 mana at some point forging this up, and you get, I think, a pretty meaningless buff in the scheme of things. Like, it reflects what the Sargeras Titan does, but I don't know. I don't think I'm happy to spend 2 mana for a little bit of extra health and taunt on my imps. I think I usually care more about just getting wide bodies and creating pressure in an imp style deck, which the base level of this actually isn't bad. I think the discard a spell aspect reads like a downside. Obviously, you don't want to lose cards in hand, and you know, in a random deck construction, that would be true. You would lose a resource and you'd be sad. But we actually have a couple really good discard payoffs in Warlock. There's the Soul Barrage, the 5-mana Warlock spell that deals 6 to enemies randomly, kind of arcane missiles for 6. Here, let me just search discard so I can pull these up for you guys real quick. So you have some good payoffs. There's Soul Barrage here. This one deals 6 to all among enemies. And you've also got Suffocating Shadows as well, which will destroy a random enemy. So I don't know, man. I could see an Imp deck that doesn't need that many spells that's able to weave in Suffocating Shadows and Soul Barrage and maybe a little bit of a discard package to support all that. It's not impossible, right? It may be a little too restrictive. It may walk you down too narrow of a path from a deck building standpoint, but you know, a 4-drop that summons you 3 bodies and deals 6 split among all enemies, that's a pretty good play, right? That's going to help you get some damage, clean up a board a little bit maybe, and still develop some awesome threats. And if you've got Imp synergies on top of that, I don't know, man. I think this actually kind of fits in rather nicely. So I guess I wouldn't sleep on this card. It's also just noteworthy that sometimes you won't have a spell in hand, and this won't discard anything if you're just an Imp deck with a lot of minions. So I don't know, man. I actually think this downside's not that notable, and it's a solid Imp card. It's not like way better than the other Imps we've had. You know, there's the Imp that if you infuse will make you 3/3/3 Imps on board. That benefits a little more because the base version's an Imp. The Disciple itself is not an Imp. But do you need more of these? I don't know, maybe. So in essence, I wouldn't totally write this one off. I actually think this card looks okay. Loken, Jailer of Yogg-Saron is a 4-star card. Imprisoned Horror is a 4-star card. Wing Welding is a 4-star card. Monstrous Form is a 4-star card. Chaotic Consumption is a 4-star card. Mortal Eradication is a 3-star card. Thornveil Tentacle is a 2-star card. Disciple of Sargeras is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. We are down to this is our second to last review. We got only Warrior Remains tomorrow. And that's it for the Titans reviews, man. This went fast, despite, I think, being the most reviews I've ever done for a single expansion, the way they stretch these out. But still seem to go pretty quick. The cards are cool. So share your thoughts on these below. Let me know what you think is going to be good or bad. Curious to hear those thoughts. Thanks, as always, for watching. And until next time, game on.